Welcome to Inside the Mask, the podcast where we cover off all your favorite horror movies with a true crime twist. This week, we're not quite out of the woods just yet, and before heading back into a more urban series of crimes, we're first making a pit stop at another admittedly less iconic summer camp slasher from 1983. It's the story of a traumatic series of events that rocked a youth summer camp program in the 80s, where after an initial few seemingly tragic accidents, it becomes apparent to the staff on site that there may be something more sinister at large, and it wouldn't be long before the body count would begin to pile up. But even with this increasingly violent victim count, the most shocking revelation in the case would be discovered at the dramatic conclusion, when investigators would apprehend the killer in question and famously reveal their surprising identity. I'm your host, Evan Taggart, and this is Sleepaway Camp. It's the summer of 1983, and in the late hours of the evening, local police authorities in upstate New York receive a panicked 911 call. In the recorded audio, a local lead summer camp counselor, identified as Ronnie Angelo, claims that there's been a murder at the remote location of Camp Arawak, a popular youth and school-age summer camp in the area. When investigators arrive on scene, they would discover a total of 8 victims spread across the grounds, both out in the open and concealed. And upon apprehension of the now infamous school-aged murderer Peter Baker, the case would come crashing to a shocking conclusion, one that would surprise both police and witnesses in the case alike. Now, before examining the confirmed murders at Camp Arawak in 1983, it's important to note that this actually wouldn't be the first time authorities were called to the camp that summer. In facts that are often highly criticized by news and local media, it's confirmed that by the time the violent murders would have been discovered a mere few days later, police had actually already been called out to Camp Arawak a total of 3 times. Now, these initial calls were a combination of investigations into mysterious deaths on the camp that were attributed at the time to tragic but fatal accidents, as well as another near-fatal accident involving one of the on-site staff at the camp itself. Chronologically, the first victim in the case, though it wouldn't be suggested as such until much later in the investigation, was likely that of the resident lead cook, named in reports as Artie. Now, Artie was first discovered by another kitchen staff member 3 days after the grand opening of Camp Arawak, who found Artie writhing and screaming on the kitchen floor of the facility. Medical reports indicate that Artie had suffered a series of severe burns to the vast majority of his body, including both his face and his eyes, as the result of an overturned pot of boiling water that was left unattended on the nearby stove in the kitchen. Somehow, assumed to have been a series of unfortunate events, this vat of water had completely spilled onto this lead chef, rendering him severely burned and near fatally injured. He was initially treated on site by responding paramedics, but due to the nature of his injuries, Artie was ultimately transferred to an off-site medical facility for potential recovery. Now, there's no confirmed connection here to Artie's mishap and the killer in question, but witnesses did report that Artie had displayed aggressive and disturbingly suggestive behaviors to numerous children at the camp, suggesting a possible motive to his potential murder or simply harm to his well-being if foul play was indeed involved. And given the nature of the next 2 deaths at the camp, also deemed to have been accidents initially, but suggested to be possibly linked to the Camp Arawak killer, it's highly possible here that Artie simply managed to survive what was an otherwise attempted murder on his own life. The first confirmed casualty of the 1983 killings was discovered concealed on the beach during a routine early morning cleanup of the grounds at the hands of the employed staff there. The body of a teenaged camper, identified in reports only as Kenny, was found underneath an overturned canoe on the grounds. Now, Kenny was fully clothed at the time of his death, and initial reports suggest that he was the victim of an accidental drowning. Later autopsy confirmed that this actually was his cause of death, but crime scene photos do suggest traumas to his body, notably visible wounds on his upper torso and on his neck. But it was determined later in coroner reports that these were likely instead more the result of various wildlife predators in the area that may have actually descended on Kenny's body after his actual death the night before. Interviews with witnesses on site indicate that Kenny had just simply disappeared the evening prior, when he'd gone out on the lake in a canoe without a life jacket. Now, further to this, toxicology reports show that Kenny had high levels of THC in his blood at the time of his own death, and as such, that was enough to conclude that he likely died from accidental drowning. However, it was also reported that Kenny was a very strong swimmer, and that in spite of his recreational drug use, he seemed to be otherwise of sound mind when he ventured out onto the lake alone. Now, additionally, there were no obvious bruises or lesions to Kenny's body beyond that of the aforementioned scavenger wounds, suggesting the idea of Kenny falling unconscious or the like was really kind of unlikely. Still, the evidence at hand was deemed circumstantial at best, and as such, the camp was allowed to continue to operate. Now, it would be a decision with increasingly fatal consequences. It would be only one day later that the next body at Camp Arawak was discovered. The remains of teenage victim Billy are found in the washroom area of one of the cabins on site. Crime scene photos here paint a pretty simple picture. The victim's body was discovered covered in bees, having suffered a series of fatal and extensive bee stings as a result. Now, police also locate a beehive near the victim's body and suggest that it's quite possible that during an otherwise routine bathroom break, Billy might have inadvertently agitated the territorial hive, resulting in his own death from some kind of an anaphylactic shock as the result of the extensive attack from the insects. However, interestingly, investigation notes also include the fact that a screening on an adjacent window in the room was found to have been damaged, reported as cut open by a blade of some kind. And in addition, none of the other witnesses who were attending the same cabin had reported seeing any bees in the area or a hive of any kind. So, was foul play involved? Well, all of these facts are determined by police to be, again, circumstantial. But at this point, that simply would not be enough for numerous parents and guardians in the area. Now, after the news of this second death at the camp went public, many of the parents of the attending children understandably pulled their kids from the summer camp itself. And unknowingly, this may have actually spared many of their lives in the violent events that were to follow. It's estimated that on the night of the final murders in the Camp Arawak Massacre of 1983, a mere 25 campers remained on site. And before the night would be over, a total of 5 campers and 3 staff members would tragically lose their lives at the hands of serial killer Peter Baker. The first murders discovered on the Camp Arawak grounds on the night the suspect was arrested were tragically 4 children, ultimately unnamed in police reports. These victims were found partially dismembered in a wooded area of the camp itself, and according to witness statements had planned on an almost outdoor sleepover of sorts the night that they were killed. According to crime scene photographs, the victims were still asleep in their sleeping bags when they were murdered, indicating that they were likely taken by surprise by the killer Peter Baker at some point during the late hours of the night. Now, these bodies were what prompted lead camp counselors to make this initial 911 call to police in the first place, kicking off a search at the hands of both authorities and on-site staff, where the other bodies in the series of violent deaths would be subsequently uncovered. The first body located thereafter was that of the established Camp Arawak owner and operator, named as Mel Kostick, who was found deceased near an outdoor archery range on the grounds. Kostick was killed by an archery arrow that police estimated was fired from 10 to 15 feet from his person. The arrow itself fatally penetrated Kostick's throat, ultimately resulting in his own death. And upon expanding their search to the nearby cabins, authorities next discovered the remains of 2 murdered female camp counselors. The first female victim, named by authorities as Meg Cameron, was found in the shower area of her cabin, where it was determined that she had been killed by stab wounds to her torso, specifically to her back and traveling down to her pelvic area. Now, given the fact that the victim was not clothed at the time of her death, investigators believe that Meg was likely taken by surprise while showering, and in a rather chilling implication, that the killer may have actually been waiting outside the shower itself, as the blade of the knife that fatally wounded Meg was determined to have entered her body from through the plastic shower wall. Now, the second victim here is arguably the most famous death in the case. And as a bit of a warning here, the manner in which camp counselor Judy Beck was murdered is truly disturbing. Judy's body was found concealed under her bed in her cabin, where investigators determined that she was likely asphyxiated with her own pillow. However, an autopsy on Judy's body after her death showcased extensive internal damage, and coroners believe that Judy may have in fact been sexually assaulted and otherwise sodomized by what DNA samples confirm was, quite horrifically, her own curling iron. From this point, it doesn't take long for police to locate and apprehend the Camp Arawak killer, as their location and the location of the final murder in this case was not far away at all. As authorities descend on the beachfront of the property, the same location that prior victim Kenny was located deceased, they find the remains of the final victim in the case, and with them, the Camp Arawak killer themselves, 14-year-old Peter Baker. And yes, famously, the killer in the Camp Arawak case was, in fact, one of the very campers stationed there for the summer, an otherwise quiet and seemingly innocent 14-year-old minor. But Baker's motives and the method of operation would only prove to be more complex as the case would progress, offering insights into the killer's past, as well as the shocking revelation of their own seemingly hidden identity. Now to press pause here, there were no confirmed registrants by the name of Peter Baker on any of the logs or paperwork at Camp Arawak. As well, the campers and counselors attending the camp that summer were required to submit medical documents, including any possible allergens and the like, to avoid health mishaps and potential insurance claims. But even in these documents, signed off by local practitioners, it's also impossible to find anyone by the name of Peter Baker on the docket. So, how did this youth and reported serial killer manage to register or even be registered completely undetected? And in addition, how did nobody ask any questions regarding their identity until their eventual arrest for the murders in question? Well, for the same reason that Peter Baker was able to commit the various murders without garnering suspicion, they were not actually registered as Peter Baker at all. Instead, there was a different name on the docket, and that name was Angela Baker. Now, while that might sound confusing, to better understand this revelation, we have to go back to Baker's own reportedly tragic and abusive childhood. The origins of killer Peter Baker themselves actually trace back to a series of events that unfolded near the same camp that they would eventually be arrested at a full 8 years later, when in 1973, while vacationing with their sister Angela as well as their father Frank Baker, a horrible accident would change the trajectory of Peter's life forever. Police reports indicate that it was during a lakeside outing in 1973 that the family in question fell victim to a vehicular manslaughter when a motorized boat vessel was mistakenly piloted directly into the path of the trio as they were swimming near the shoreline. Both Frank Baker and his young daughter Angela were instantly killed in the accident, leaving a then 5-year-old Peter Baker the sole survivor. Now, police at the time determined that the individual operating the motorboat was actually an unlicensed minor, and while it's unclear if formal charges were ever laid in the case, Peter Baker was left in the care of his aunt, named in court documents as Martha Thomas, who actually already had a biological son of her own, Peter's cousin Ricky Thomas, who was also present at the Camp Arawak Massacre in 1983. Now, at some point early on in the adoption process, Martha Thomas falsified both medical and adoption records and officially changed both the name and gender of Peter Baker to that of their own sister, who had perished in the boating accident, Angela Baker. In what would become a famously shocking twist in the Camp Arawak case, it was discovered by first responders that Peter Baker and Angela Baker were, in fact, the same person, in the sense that Peter had now assumed the identity of their own biological sister Angela after her tragic death in 1973. See, for unknown reasons, Peter was actually raised from 5 years old to be Angela Baker, right down to their own physical appearance, resembling their sister as well as actually registering the name Angela Baker on the Camp Arawak camper registry. Now, this also included falsified medical records on their intake forms, which would have left Angela's own identity non-suspect until the dramatic conclusion of the case days later. It's also important to note here, this decision was reportedly not made by Peter Baker, and instead was forced onto the young child by the reportedly abusive and unstable guardian, Martha Thomas. No doubt a horrific case of child abuse that had long-standing and drastic psychological consequences on the eventual killer themselves, possibly even providing or contributing to their own motive or mental state to commit the murders in question in 1983. The true identity of Angela Baker would not be discovered until the final confrontation with police in 1983, which occurred during the evening search of the grounds after the aforementioned 911 call and subsequent discovery of the various victims of the case. In the final police reports, investigators as well as lead camp counselors Susie and Ronnie Angelo approached a bloody and horrifying scene, all taking place on the shorelines of the lake at Camp Arawak itself. It's here on the beach that they would find the bloodied remains of youth camper Paul, considered to be the final victim of Peter Baker in these 1983 killings. Paul was found to have been completely decapitated, likely using a hunting knife that was found on the killer's person at the time of their arrest by authorities. It's theorized by police here that this was likely the same weapon that may have been used in the murder of victim Meg Cameron, as the entry wounds on Meg's body match the shape and pattern of the same blade used in Paul's murder on the beach. And in addition to the body of Paul, police make another shocking discovery here. The killer themselves, Peter Baker, operating under the identity of Angela Baker, naked and covered in blood, still wielding the murder weapon in question. Police and witness reports suggest that Baker was nonverbal during their arrest and their apprehension, instead offering a series of bizarre and guttural sounds. Behaviors that actually do line up to a degree with early reports that Peter, then operating at the time as Angela, was nonverbal for at least the first initial days of their arrival at Camp Arawak. Upon the conclusion of the case and the arrest of Peter/Angela Baker, detailed records of what actually happened to the Camp Arawak killer are often confusing. Some report that they were institutionalized, no doubt the result of severe childhood abuse and trauma endured in their 5-year stay with Martha Thomas, though no formal medical records could actually be traced to this at the time of this recording. Other experts and retired law officers suggest that the killer would eventually adopt a new identity, and under a Protection Act may have actually reintegrated into society somewhere near the Rolling Hills area, also located in upstate New York. While the surviving victims in the surrounding community may never have closure in the case as a result, knowing that the killer might actually still be out there somewhere, the impact of the violent murders at Camp Arawak in 1983 and the death of owner Mel Kostick would result in the complete closure of the summer camp for good, perhaps giving some sense of finality to what would become arguably the most shocking case that the area would ever see. Thanks for listening to our true crime spin on Sleepaway Camp. I admittedly had never seen this movie in its entirety until covering it off for the podcast, and while I know it's got a bit of a cult following, I found it was just okay. Look, while the famously haunting final reveal of Angela is indeed fantastic, the movie itself was just mostly slowly paced and kind of boring. I love slow burn movies in general, but in this one I found most of the characters were pretty uninteresting and actually pretty reprehensible for the most part. A lot of the male cast are either total creeps or complete jerks, and many of the characters in general are just so mean-spirited. I'm sure it's probably done in an attempt to not feel so terrible when they eventually get their own comeuppance, but still, everyone's just a big old meanie in this movie. There's also a scene where the audience has to sit and watch a baseball game almost in real time, like for no reason. It legitimately goes nowhere, and it adds nothing to the story. It's boring, man, I'm sorry. Now, Sleepaway Camp was successful enough to get a few sequels over the years, but spoiler alert, I didn't see those either. I've heard they continue Angela's killer conquest under a new identity, which is why I included that final tidbit in the true crime twist. But for the purpose of this podcast, this one's probably going to be a one and done. Have you seen the sequels? Are they any good? Should I watch them? Let me know in the comments or on our socials at Inside the Mask Evan. I'd be curious if they get any better from here. Or hey, maybe they get worse. Now next week is April Fools, and I'm stoked to say that we're going to tackle a few out there titles that you might not be expecting for the month of April. Or if you checked out our Behind the Screams episode, you might just get a little hint for what one of them is going to be. So if you're down to follow along with some coverage of some pretty off-the-wall choices, be sure to follow, subscribe, and hit the alert button so you know when the new episodes drop. As always, I'm your host Evan Taggart, and this has been Inside the Mask.